What happens if the U.S. Vice President hands $1 to a homeless man? The gray Washington sky weighed on his shoulders like the weight of unspoken promises. J.D. Vance stood at his office window, watching the first drops of rain break against the glass. Behind him lay a stack of documents demanding the immediate attention of the Vice President of the United States. But his thoughts were far from the papers with the state seals. "Mr. Vice President, you have a meeting with the Defense Committee in an hour." The assistant's voice pulled Vance out of his reverie. "Cancel it," he replied without turning around. "Sorry? Cancel all meetings for today. Say I'm sick, or think of something else." "But sir, that's an order." Vance's voice was soft but firm. "And one more thing, Mark. I don't want an escort today. No security." "With all due respect, sir, this is a breach of protocol. Security." "Forget the protocol." Vance finally turned to his assistant. There was something in his eyes that Mark had never seen before. Fatigue, determination. "I'm not disappearing forever. I just need one day. One day without cameras, without reporters, without people listening, but not hearing." 15 minutes later, the U.S. Vice President, dressed in worn jeans, a plain shirt and a baseball cap with the logo of the Cincinnati Reds baseball team, left his residence in a modest Chevrolet. The security service had received strict orders not to follow him, and although this caused real panic among the staff, no one dared to disobey the Vice President's direct order. Vance knew where he was going. Home. Not to his posh apartment in Washington, but to his real home. Middletown, Ohio. The small industrial town where he had spent his childhood. The place where every stone remembered him as a barefoot boy, not the man whose face the entire country now knew. He turned on the radio. The news anchor's voice was routinely listing the country's problems. Rising unemployment, the crisis in the healthcare system, the increase in homeless veterans. Vance's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Numbers, statistics, percentages. Behind them, you couldn't see the faces. The real people who stood behind these dry data. The people for whom he had once come into politics. 2 hours later, he stopped at a gas station. His tank was nearly empty, and Vance himself needed coffee to chase away his fatigue. A strange sense of freedom filled him. No one here knew who he was. No one expected him to make policy statements or smile diplomatically. After paying for the gas and buying a cup of hot coffee, Vance was already heading to the car when he noticed him. The man was standing at the entrance to the store at the gas station. A tattered military jacket, a tangled beard, in his hands a cardboard sign. "Veteran, Afghanistan. Help with what you can." On his chest were faded military tags. In his eyes was that emptiness that Vance had seen too often in soldiers returning from war. Their eyes met for a moment. The U.S. Vice President and the homeless veteran begging for alms. Two citizens of the same country, separated by a gulf of social status, but united by the invisible thread of a common land. "Sir?" The veteran's hoarse voice broke the silence. "Could you help? At least $1 for food?" Something in that voice made Vance stop. He walked slowly toward the man, looking into the devils of his face. The sunken eyes, the wrinkles around his eyes, too deep for his age. "What's your name?" Vance asked, surprised by his own question. The man hesitated, as if he didn't expect anyone to ask his name. Michael Raines." "Afghanistan?" Vance nodded at the dog tags. "Kandahar," Michael answered shortly. 3 missions. The last one ended. "Not very well." Vance extended his hand. "James," he introduced himself using his middle name. "James David." Michael's hand was rough and calloused, the hand of a man accustomed to hard work. "Have you had breakfast, Michael?" Misunderstanding was reflected on the veteran's face. "No, sir." "Then let's go. I saw a cafe across the street. And please stop, Sakat. I'm not your commander." Michael hesitated, suspicion in his eyes. "I'm not a charity case," he said with sudden firmness in his voice. "I'm not the Red Cross," Vance replied with a slight smile. "Just a man who prefers not to eat breakfast alone. Besides, I need news from these parts. I haven't been to Ohio in a long time." They crossed the street and entered a small cafe that smelled of fried bacon and fresh coffee. The walls were covered with old photographs of industrial Ohio in its heyday. Vance chose a table in the corner, away from the windows. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a tired, kind face, brought the menu. "What will you order, boys?" "2 full breakfasts," Vance replied without even glancing at the menu. "And coffee, lots of coffee." Michael sat tensely, as if expecting to be asked to leave at any moment. His gaze wandered around the room, noting the exits, assessing the situation, a habit left over from the war. "Are you local?" Vance asked, sipping his coffee. "I was once," Michael shrugged. "From Cincinnati. Came back after my third deployment. Thought I'd start all over again. He fell silent, looking into his cup. But something went wrong, Vance finished for him. A bitter smile touched Michael's lips. Everything went wrong. PTSD, insomnia, nightmares. Started drinking to drown it all out. Lost my job. Wife couldn't take it anymore. And left, taking our daughter. Then the house was foreclosed on. He looked up. Classic American story, huh? Vance was silent. He had heard hundreds of such stories. He had read reports, statistics, analytical notes. But numbers on paper were one thing, and a living person in front of you was quite another. Have you tried getting help through the Veterans Assistance Program? Vance asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Michael laughed, and there was more bitterness in that laugh than amusement. A support program? Are you serious? 8 months of waiting to see a psychologist? Medications that only make things worse. Bureaucracy that makes you want to howl. He paused. You know what's funniest? I'm begging for alms from the very country I was willing to die for. The waitress brought breakfast. Bacon and eggs, toast, potatoes. Michael dug into the food, trying not to show how hungry he was, but his hands were shaking slightly. And you? He asked with his mouth full. What brought you to these parts? Vance broke off a piece of toast, considering his answer. I grew up not far from here, in Middletown. Seriously? Michael raised his eyebrows. And what? You ran away from this hole at the first opportunity? You could say that. Vance found himself speaking frankly for the first time in a long time. The Army, then college, law school, climbing the social ladder, just like my grandmother dreamed of. Your parents are probably proud. A shadow crossed Vance's face. My mother struggled with addiction most of my life. I was raised by my grandmother. She was an incredible woman, strong as steel. She believed that I could be more than... He trailed off. Than the average guy from Middletown, Michael finished for him with understanding. Yes, Vance met his gaze, but sometimes I wonder if I've strayed too far from my roots. Michael put down his fork, looking closely at his interlocutor. You know what drives me crazy about politicians? He asked suddenly. They all pretend to understand us. Middle class, working people, the real America. They repeat all these phrases on TV, but not one of them has the slightest idea how we live. Vance felt his pulse quicken. He had found himself in the very conversation his soul had been craving. A conversation without filters, without political correctness, without regard for ratings and polls. Especially this new vice president, Michael continued, not noticing how his interlocutor had tensed. Vance came from the same places as us. Wrote a book about how hard life is for ordinary people. And now he sits in his office in Washington and signs papers that only complicate our lives. Don't you think he might have retained a connection to his roots? Vance asked cautiously. Michael shook his head. Power changes people, James. Always. They forget where they came from as soon as they put on a $2,000 suit. Vance thoughtfully turned his cup of coffee in his hands. Where are you going? He asked after a pause. Nowhere in particular. Michael shrugged. What, I wander around the country. Sometimes I manage to earn some money on a farm or a construction site. Vance made a decision before he had time to consider all the consequences. I'm going to Middletown. I can give you a ride if you want. Why do you need this? Michael's voice was suspicious again. Vance met his gaze. Maybe I just don't want to be alone. Michael studied his face as if trying to solve a riddle. You're a weird guy, you know? But thank you. I accept the offer. By the time they left the cafe, the rain had stopped and the sun was peeking out timidly from behind the clouds. Vance headed for his car, Michael following behind, clutching a battered army backpack to his chest, his only possessions. You know, Michael said as they got into the car, you're the first person in a long time who didn't just toss me a coin, but looked me in the eye and listened. Maybe people just need to look each other in the eye more often, Vance replied, starting the engine. They hit the highway into the heart of America's Rust Belt, where the story of J.D. Vance began. Little did either of them know that this chance encounter would change the fate of not just the two of them, but of an entire country, the invisible threads of which were woven into a single knot at a gas station on the side of the road between Washington and Middletown. Now I'll create a new artifact for the full second chapter. An artifact identifier. Chapter 2 complete. Type. Text. Chatan. Mark down. Title. The highway stretched out before them like a gray ribbon, leading into the heart of America's Rust Belt. There were few cars. The route had long since fallen out of favor, as had the cities it passed through. Vance drove confidently, glancing at his passenger from time to time. Michael sat with his forehead pressed to the glass, watching the landscapes pass by. Haven't been in these parts for a long time? Vance asked, breaking the silence. Michael straightened up, rubbing his neck. About 3 years, probably. The last time I passed by, when there was still hope. He didn't finish the sentence. Hope for what? That the American dream doesn't just exist in politicians' speeches. Michael chuckled. You know, I came back from Afghanistan with a Purple Heart and the belief that I had done something important, that I had protected my country. And then I realized that the country doesn't care about people like me. Vance tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The words hit home. Over the course of his political career, he had given dozens of speeches about the heroism of American soldiers, about the nation's debt to those who risked their lives to keep it safe. But how much real change had he made? How many veterans programs actually worked? Not all politicians are soulless creatures, he said quietly. Really? Michael turned to him. Do you have any idea what it's like to come back from war and find that your own country isn't ready for you? What it's like to wait months to see the doctor you were promised in the TV commercials? What it's like to fill out endless forms and questionnaires, proving over and over that your injuries are real? The road ahead began to narrow. On both sides appeared the first signs of approaching an industrial zone, abandoned warehouses, rusting billboards promising goods that had long since ceased to be produced. Vance hesitated. I understand your disappointment. There! Michael slammed his fist on the dashboard. Chenery, well, that's what they say. We understand your disappointment. As if it's disappointment and not betrayal. As if we were just rejected from the school dance and not left on the street to die. He paused as he noticed a Welcome to Middletown sign appear up ahead. Faded paint, bent metal, a symbol of a town that was a shadow of its former self. Welcome to the capital of the American dream, Vance muttered, slowing down. Michael gave him a questioning look. Are you really from here? Every stone remembers me as a kid, Vance answered, turning onto the main street. Middletown greeted them with silence and emptiness. The once bustling main street was now full of boarded-up storefronts. For rent, for sale, forever closed, these signs became the new residents of the city. Mess, Michael breathed out. This is your home? There was once. Vance stopped the car near the old library building. Can you imagine? I used to come here every day after school. It was the only place where I could do my homework in peace. Why not at home? Vance chuckled. My mother, she had problems. Drugs, men, constant scandals. The house was a battlefield, not a place for learning. He got out of the car and headed toward the library building. Michael followed him, holding his battered backpack. The library, oddly enough, was still open. It was cool and quiet inside, smelling of old books and wood. James? James David. The elderly woman behind the counter looked surprised. My God, I can't believe my eyes. Vance froze. He hadn't thought about being recognized. He certainly hadn't thought about anyone remembering his middle name. Mrs. Wilson, he smiled tightly. You're still here. Where should I be? The woman came out from behind the counter. Someone has to preserve this island of civilization. Her gaze moved to Michael, and her smile faded slightly. And this? My friend, Vance answered quickly. Michael, he's a veteran. Afghanistan. Oh, Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened with understanding. Welcome home, young man. Although it's not what it used to be. Michael nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable in this quiet abode of books. We just dropped by to say hello, Vance said. I'm showing my friend around town. Then I won't keep you, Mrs. Wilson smiled understandingly. But come back again. I've saved your favorite book, James. As Vance left the library, he felt the tension leave him. Michael looked at him curiously. Does she know you as James? He asked. I don't like using my first name, Vance answered evasively. Too many memories. They got into the car and continued on their way, Vance leading them along familiar streets, pointing out places from his childhood. There was a factory here where my grandfather worked. It closed in the 90s. And there, he pointed to a vacant lot overgrown with weeds. There was a movie theater, the best place in town. What happened to this town? Michael asked, looking at another abandoned factory building. Same thing as the whole Rust Belt, Vance said. Globalization, outsourcing, automation. Manufacturing has gone to China and Mexico. And with it, jobs, hope, a future. He turned onto a quiet street lined with modest houses. Some were well kept, with neat lawns. Others looked abandoned, with broken windows and caved-in roofs. Vance stopped at one of these houses, a two-story structure with peeling paint and a boarded-up front door. "This is where I grew up," he said quietly, "with my mother and grandmother." Michael stared at the house in silence, as if trying to imagine young Vance running up these steps, playing in this yard. "It looks familiar," he finally said. "I had a similar childhood, only we had a trailer instead of a house." Vance got out of the car and Michael followed him. They approached the house, stepping carefully along the overgrown path. "My grandmother," Vance began, looking out at the empty windows, "was an incredible woman, tough as a rock. She lived through the Great Depression, through poverty, through domestic violence, and she still got up at 5 every morning to go to work and provide for us." "Mine too," Michael answered quietly. "She died while I was in Afghanistan. I couldn't even come to the funeral." Vance fell silent. He remembered his grandmother, her strong arms, her unwavering belief that he could break out of this place, become something more. He remembered his mother too, a beautiful but broken woman who constantly sought solace in drugs in the arms of random men. They walked around the house and stopped at the backyard. The old tree was still there, though its branches weren't as spreading as Vance remembered. "I built my first fort here," he said with a smile. "I was probably about 8 years old. My grandmother gave me some old boards and a hammer. She said a man should know how to build." "My father taught me how to hunt," Michael replied. "He said a man should be able to get food. It came in handy in Afghanistan, you know." Suddenly, Vance noticed movement inside the house. A shadow flashed through the dirty window. "There's someone there," he tensed. Michael instantly straightened up, his soldier instincts taking over. "Stay here," he whispered, slowly approaching the back door. "No, wait." Vance grabbed his arm. "It could be anyone. A homeless person, a drug addict. All the more so." Michael carefully freed himself. "I saw guys like that in Kandahar. They are unpredictable when they are scared." Before Vance could protest, Michael was already at the door. Vance followed, cursing himself for bringing them here. The back door was ajar. Michael pushed it open carefully and stepped inside. Vance followed, trying to walk as quietly as possible. Inside, the house smelled of damp and rotten wood and something else. Desperation, if desperation could have a smell. They passed through the kitchen where Wenzel's grandmother had once prepared her famous dishes. Now it was just an empty room with a collapsed ceiling and broken glass. In the living room, they found the source of the movement. A young man in his early 20s was sitting in the corner, his arms wrapped around his knees. His eyes widened in fear when he saw Vance and Michael. "Hey, kid," Michael said softly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "We're not going to hurt you." The young man pressed himself against the wall as if trying to merge with it. I didn't take anything, I swear," he muttered. "I was just looking for a place to spend the night." Vance felt something tighten in his chest. This boy could have been himself 20 years ago, if not for his grandmother, if not for her faith, her support. "I'm James," he said, approaching the boy. "This is my friend Michael. And you?" "Tyler," the boy answered uncertainly. "Look, if this is your property, I'll leave. No problem, okay?" "This was my house once," Vance replied. "But it's nobody's now. What brings you here, Tyler?" The young man looked down. "My mother kicked me out. Her new boyfriend. Well, we don't get along. I'm looking for a job, but it's hard to find anything here." Vance and Michael looked at each other. They both saw themselves reflected in this guy. Different lives, but similar stories. "Do you have somewhere to eat?" Michael asked. Tyler shrugged. "Free lunches at the church on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Other day, as luck would have it." Vance took out his wallet and pulled out all the cash he had, about $300. "Take it." He handed the money to Tyler. "Find a normal place. Eat something hot." Tyler looked at the money like it was a snake ready to bite. "I don't take handouts." "It's not a handout," Vance said. "It's an investment. I was just like you, and someone helped me. Now it's my turn." Michael watched the scene with an unreadable expression. As they walked out of the house, leaving a stunned Tyler with the money, he finally spoke. "Were you really the same?" "Yes," answered Vance. "Only I was luckier. I had a grandmother who believed in me, and teachers who supported me, and the army, which gave me discipline and purpose." They walked back to the car in silence. The sun was already setting, painting the abandoned factories golden, as if trying to restore them to their former glory. "Where to now?" Michael asked as they got into the car. "There's one place I want to show you," Vance replied, starting the engine. They left Middletown and headed down a narrow road toward the hills. A few miles later, Vance turned onto a dirt road that led to an abandoned steel mill. The huge building, with its roof collapsed and its empty windows, resembled the skeleton of a dinosaur that had died out in the distant past. "My father worked here," Vance said, stopping the car. "Before he left us. He was a steel worker, Said he made the backbone of America. They got out of the car and walked up to the factory gate. A chain with a padlock blocked the way, but there was a gap in the fence nearby, wide enough for a person to pass through. Are you sure you want to go there? Michael asked, looking at the dilapidated building. No, Vance replied, but I feel like I should. They squeezed through the gap and entered the factory grounds. The area was littered with pieces of equipment, rusty parts, and shards of glass. Nature was slowly reclaiming the land. Weeds were growing between the concrete slabs, and the walls were covered in moss and lichen. They entered the main workshop, a huge, high-ceilinged room where furnaces had once roared, turning ore into steel. Now it was silent, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the wind blowing through the empty spaces. Can you imagine? Hundreds of people worked here, Vance said, looking around. They made steel for skyscrapers, bridges, cars. They created the future with their own hands. And now? Michael asked. And now that future is being built in China, Vance replied bitterly. And those people, some of them drank themselves to death, some of them got hooked on opioids, some of them just gave up. His voice echoed off the walls, creating the impression that the factory itself was responding to him, agreeing with every word. They climbed the rickety stairs to the observation deck, which overlooked the entire plant and its surroundings. The sun was setting, painting the landscape red, like blood flowing from the wounds of a dying giant. You know what the worst thing is? Vance said, leaning on the railing. It's not just buildings and cars, it's lives. When a plant like that closes, a whole town dies. People lose not just their jobs, but their meaning, their pride, their self-respect. Michael was silent, looking into the distance. His face was inscrutable, but a storm of emotions could be seen in his eyes. When I came back from Afghanistan, he finally said quietly, I couldn't sleep. Nightmares, flashbacks. Every sharp sound took me back there, to the dust and blood. He paused. The doctor prescribed me opioids, said they'd help, and they did, for a while. Vance turned to face him. Have you become addicted? Like half the veterans I know, Michael shrugged. First it was medicine, then it was a crutch, then it was all I had left. He sat down on a concrete block, his head down. I lost everything, James. My job, my family, my home, my dignity. Do you understand what it means to beg from passing cars? To stand there with your hand outstretched when you're used to protecting others? Vance sat down next to him, feeling a lump in his throat. How did you get out? He asked. Shawnee, who said I got out? Michael chuckled bitterly. I've been clean for 3 months, but every day is a battle. Every darn day I think about how easy it would be to find a fix and just let it all go. He looked up at Vance, and there was such pain in his eyes that Vance had to turn away. You know what the worst part is? I still love this country. Despite everything, I still believe in it, in what it could be, in what it should be. The words hit Vance with the force of a freight train. He, the Vice President of the United States, sat here in the ruins of the American dream, next to the man who had been betrayed by that dream but who still believed in it. Me too, Vance answered quietly. I still believe too. The sun had almost set, plunging the factory into twilight. The wind had picked up, bringing with it the smell of approaching rain. We have to go, Vance said, standing up. We'll spend the night at a motel in town. As they were descending from the landing, the wooden step under Michael's foot suddenly cracked. He lost his balance and fell, managing to grab the railing at the last moment. Darn it, he cursed, hanging over the abyss. Vance reacted instantly. He reached down and grabbed Michael's arm, trying to hold him back. Hold on, he shouted. I'll pull you out. But the railing Michael was holding on to began to move away from the wall. Vance strained with all his strength, trying to pull him up, but to no avail. Michael was too heavy, and his position too unstable. Let go, Michael shouted. You'll fall with me. No way. Vance gritted his teeth with tension. Hold on, darn it. At that moment, something changed in Michael's eyes. He saw before him not just a random fellow traveler, but a person willing to risk himself for another. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, he felt that his life mattered to someone else. With a new surge of strength, Michael grabbed the edge of the platform with his other hand, and with Vance's help, managed to pull himself up and escape from the death trap. They both collapsed onto the concrete floor, breathing heavily. Thank you, Michael breathed out when he could speak. You could have died. You would have done the same, Vance replied. They lay on the cold concrete, looking up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. You know, Michael said after a long pause, for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone cared. Vance was silent, processing the words. Someone cared. Wasn't that the point? Wasn't that what every person yearned for? To know that their life, their pain, their hopes mattered to someone else? When they finally got down and out of the factory grounds, it was completely dark. They got into the car and headed back to the city, each lost in their own thoughts. There's a cheap motel on the outskirts, Vance said, breaking the silence. We can spend the night there and decide what to do next in the morning. Michael nodded, looking out the window. Thank you, he said so quietly that Vance could barely hear. For all of this, for seeing me as a person and not just a homeless beggar. Vance felt something inside him break. All his political speeches, programs, plans. What did they mean to people like Michael? Beautiful words, empty promises. But all you had to do was see the person, look him in the eyes, listen to his story. They pulled up to the motel, a rundown building with a flashing neon sign. Vance paid for 2 rooms, but Michael stopped him. One is enough, he said. I don't want to be alone today. Too many memories. Vance nodded understandingly. The cramped twin room smelled of damp and cheap air freshener. Michael sat on the bed, pulled a tattered photograph out of his backpack, and stared at it for a long time. My daughter, he said, noticing Vance's gaze. She's 8 now. I haven't seen her in over a year. Vance sat down opposite him. Why? My ex? She doesn't want me to talk to her. She says I'm a bad example. His voice wavered. And you know, she's right. What kind of father am I? A homeless drug addict. Ex-addict, Vance corrected him. And you can change your life. Michael looked at him with such desperate hope that Vance's heart sank. Do you really believe that? After everything you've seen today? After everything you know about people like me? I believe it more than ever, Vance replied firmly. Because today I didn't see statistics or numbers. I saw you. A man who has been through trouble and is still able to reach out to another. A man who, despite everything, still loves his country. Michael lowered his head, hiding the tears that welled up in his eyes. You're a strange fellow, James, he said hoarsely. Not like the others. You too, Vance replied. They sat in silence until Michael spoke again. I have to tell you something. Michael looked Vance straight in the eye. Today, at the plant, when I was hanging over the abyss, I recognized you. You are not James David. You are Vice President J.D. Vance. The words hung in the musty air of the motel room. Vance froze, feeling the ground slipping from under his feet. All the masks were off. All the walls were crumbling. How long have you known? He asked after a long pause. Michael leaned back against the bed, not taking his eyes off the vice president. I suspected something else in the car. Your speech, too correct for an ordinary working-class guy. But I only became sure at the factory when you tried to save me. The light fell on your face in a certain way, and I recognized you. You're on the news every night. Vance stood up and walked to the window. Beyond the dirty glass lay Middletown, the town of his childhood, the town he had left behind to rise to the very pinnacle of power, the town that was slowly dying without him. Why didn't you tell me right away? He turned to Michael. Why didn't you tell me who you really were? Michael retorted. Were you trying to play the Good Samaritan? Or were you gathering material for another speech about forgotten America? There was bitterness in his voice, but not anger. More like disappointment. I wanted a day without protocol, Vance said quietly. A day without bodyguards, without aides, without cameras watching my every move. A day when I could talk to people like a human being, not a politician. And how did it feel? Michael asked with a slight grin. Did you like being an ordinary mortal? Vance walked over to his bed and sat down, holding his head in his hands. I never stopped being him, he said. Despite the title, the power, all the trappings, inside I'm still the same kid from Middletown who wanted to change the world. And what happened to that dream? Michael leaned forward. Because you know, from my perspective, the world hasn't changed much for the better. Vance looked up, his eyes showing the weariness he usually hid so carefully from the public. You have no idea how complicated it is, he said. The system, it's like a huge machine with 1,000 moving parts. You pull one lever and 10 other parts start moving in unpredictable directions. Don't try to feed me that political failure, Michael suddenly snapped. I'm not a voter at a rally. I'm a man begging on the side of the road because your system broke me and threw me out. Vance winced as if struck. The words hit too close to the truth. You're right, he said after a pause. I'm guilty. We're all guilty. We talk about supporting veterans, fighting the opioid crisis, restoring jobs. But in the end, it all comes down to speeches and political gamesmanship. Michael stood up and paced the cramped room, his face showing an internal struggle. You know what's ironic, he said finally? I voted for you. I believe that a guy from Middletown who had seen all this destruction, who had written a book about the hillbillies, would finally make a difference. These words hit Vance harder than any accusation. He remembered his promises, his determination to change the system from within. When and how did he start compromising? I tried, he said quietly. I really did, but... But what? Michael interrupted. Too complicated? Too many obstacles? Or is it just easier to go with the flow, enjoying the perks of power? He walked up close to Vance, looking him straight in the eyes. Do you know how many of my friends committed suicide after returning from Afghanistan? 17. 17 guys who were ready to die for their country, but couldn't live in it after the war. Vance was silent. What could he say? What words could even come close to the scale of this tragedy? I'm sorry, he finally squeezed out. Pity? Michael shook his head. You have power, Vance. Real power. You could have changed something. But instead you run away, play the regular guy, and tomorrow you'll go back to your office and continue signing the same papers. Vance rose slowly. For the first time in a long time, he felt not just tired but truly furious. Not at Michael, but at the system, at the circumstances, at himself. You think I haven't tried? He said, raising his voice. I proposed a new veterans program, and it was killed in Congress. I advocated for funding opioid addiction treatment centers and was called soft on criminals. I tried to fight corporations moving production overseas and was told it was the inevitable process of globalization. He stopped, breathing heavily. But you're right. I started to give in. I started to accept compromises. I started to believe that the system was stronger than me. Michael looked at him for a long moment, as if he could see right through him. Then why are you here? He asked quietly. Why did you run away from Washington if you didn't sense that something was wrong? Vance was at a loss for an answer. Those 24 hours away from Washington, away from protocol, away from the constant pressure, what was it? An escape? Or a search for something lost? I don't know, he answered honestly. Maybe I was looking for a reminder of who I was, who I should be. Michael walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. You know what's the worst thing? I can't even hate you, because I see that you're broken too. In your own way, in your own golden cage, but no less broken than I am. He turned to Vance. What are you going to do next? Go back to Washington and pretend nothing happened? Vance didn't have time to answer. His phone, which he had kept switched off until now, suddenly came to life. A second emergency number, which only the closest employees knew about. Yes, he answered without looking at Michael. His assistant's voice sounded panicked. Mr. Vice President, thank God. We've been trying to contact you for hours. The entire security service is looking for you. The media is starting to ask questions. CNN is preparing a story about your disappearance. Mark, Vance interrupted, I'm fine. I'll be back tomorrow morning. Until then, no comments to the press. But sir, the president? I'll talk to the president myself, Vance said firmly. Right now, I need a few more hours unsupervised. That's an order, Mark. He turned off the phone and turned to Michael, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. Duty's call? Michael asked. Not yet, Vance replied. I have until the morning. He walked up to the door. Come on, he said. I want to show you something. Michael hesitated. Where? There is one more place I must visit, and I want you to come with me. Middletown at night was a different town. Empty streets, dim streetlights, the occasional window glowing yellow. Vance's car moved slowly through the familiar streets until it stopped outside a small bar on the outskirts of town. The neon sign for Joe's barely flickered in the darkness. Why are we here? Michael asked as they got out of the car. This place. Vance paused for a moment. This is where the locals gather. The workers, the miners, the veterans. This is the last refuge of old Middletown. They walked into the bar and were immediately hit by a wave of sounds. Music from an old jukebox, the hum of conversations, the clatter of billiard balls. The smell of beer, cigarette smoke, and sweat created an atmosphere that was unmistakable. Vance walked toward the counter, trying to keep to the shadows. Here, in this setting, in simple clothes, without security or entourage, he might not be recognized. He hoped so. 2 beers, he said to the bartender, a middle-aged man with tattoos on his arms. The bartender nodded and poured them beers. Vance paid and led Michael to a table at the back, where they could talk without shouting over the music. My father used to come here every night after work, Vance said, looking around. At least that's what my grandmother said. He left when I was 3, so I don't really remember him. Michael took a sip of beer, studying Vance's face. Do you look like him? My grandmother said he did, Vance said. But I think she wanted to see the good in him. The truth is he was a drunk and he beat my mother. She started taking drugs to cope. Then he just left. A classic story of working-class degradation. He said the last sentence with bitterness, as if quoting someone. "Why are you telling me this?" Michael asked. Vance looked him straight in the eyes. "Because you have a right to know who I really am. Not the vice president, not a politician, not a best-selling author, but a boy from Middletown who was one hair away from repeating his father's fate." Michael was silent, waiting for him to continue. "You know why I wrote that book?" Vance continued. "Not to become famous, not to build a political career. I wanted to understand what went wrong, why places like Middletown started dying, why people like my father were becoming shadows of their former selves, why we, as a nation, continue to ignore entire regions, entire populations." "And what conclusions did you come to?" Michael asked. Vance took a sip of beer. "That everything is more complicated than it seems, that you can't blame only the system or only personal responsibility, that we are all entangled in a web of circumstances, history, elections." He didn't finish his thought. His attention was drawn to the noise at the bar. A group of young men, clearly drunk, surrounded an elderly man sitting alone. "Hey, old man, you've got the best seat," one of them said, putting his hand on the elderly visitor's shoulder. "I've been sitting here for 20 years, son," he answered calmly, without looking up from his glass. "Shifforinum." "Well, times are changing." The guy chuckled, exchanging glances with his friends. "Maybe it's time to give way to the young?" The atmosphere in the bar began to change. The regulars tensed up. Some moved away. Some, on the contrary, moved closer. Vance stood up without thinking about the consequences. "Vance, don't," Michael said quietly, trying to stop him. "If they recognize you—" But Vance was already heading to the counter. "Guys," he said, approaching the group, "why don't you find another place? The bar is big." The young men turned around, looking appraisingly at the new participant in the conflict. "Who are you?" asked the ringleader, a guy with a shaved head and a tattoo on his neck. "Just a visitor," Vance answered calmly, "who thinks one should respect one's elders." The guy stepped towards him, clearly intending to intimidate him. "Really? And I think you should mind your own business if you don't want problems." Vance did not back down. Years of political struggle had taught him not to show fear. "Maybe," he said, "but in my hometown it was customary to respect your elders and not cause trouble in bars." "Your hometown?" The guy grinned. "What is it?" "Middletown," Vance answered simply. "I grew up here." Something in his voice made the boy look more closely at his face, and then his eyes widened in recognition. "Your mother," he said. "It's Vice President Vance." A murmur went through the bar. People started turning around, craning their necks to get a better look. "It's really him," the bartender confirmed, coming closer. "J.D. Vance. Our guy." Vance felt a wave of attention wash over him. He hadn't planned on revealing his identity, but it was too late now. "Mr. Vice President," the older man rose from his seat, extending his hand. "Roy Thompson. I worked with your grandfather in the steel mill." Vance shook his hand, feeling a lump in his throat. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Thompson." Now the entire bar was in motion. People were coming up, introducing themselves, clapping him on the shoulder, shaking his hand. Someone asked for an autograph on a napkin. Someone offered to drink to their guy in Washington. The guys who started the conflict stepped aside, clearly embarrassed that they almost got into a fight with the country's vice president. Michael watched the scene from their table, keeping to himself, out of the limelight. Vance caught his eye several times, trying to silently apologize for the intrusion. Finally, the bartender raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Vice President," he said when the noise had died down a little, "what brings you to our humble bar? Without security? Without an entourage?" Vance looked around at the faces around him. Tired, worn, life-scorched faces of people who had continued to fight against all odds. People he had once sworn to represent in power. "I came home," he answered simply, "to remember who I am and where I came from." "And what are your impressions?" Someone from the crowd asked. "Do you like what you see?" There was no aggression in the question, only bitterness. Vance felt something inside him break. "No," he answered honestly. "I don't like it. The city is dying. People are suffering. And I, with all my power, couldn't change it." There was silence in the bar. No one expected such an answer from a politician. "Then why are you here?" asked old Mr. Thompson, "if you can't change anything?" Vance looked at Michael, who met his gaze. The homeless veteran's eyes were challenging. "What are you going to tell them, Vice President?" "Because I have to try again," Vance said, speaking to everyone and to himself at the same time. "Because I can't give up, even if it seems like the system is stronger than me. Because," he paused, choosing his words, "because I promised my grandmother that I would not forget where I came from." And I broke that promise. I started playing by Washington's rules, accepting compromises, believing that small steps are better than nothing. But isn't it, someone asked. Not if those small steps don't lead to real change, Vance said. Not if places like Middletown keep dying and people like... He glanced at Michael. Like our veterans, keep begging on the streets. The bar was quiet again. Vance could feel his heart pounding. He had just given a speech that, if leaked to the press, could have cost him his career. A speech that contradicted the official administration line. "What are you going to do?" asked the bartender. Vance didn't have time to answer. The bar doors swung open and 3 men in suits with earphones and worried faces burst into the room. Secret Service agents. "Mr. Vice President," one of them said, quickly approaching Vance, "we need to get you out of here immediately. The situation is unsafe." Vance felt irritation wash over him. "Who ordered you to find me?" he asked sharply. "I gave clear instructions that I wanted to be alone." "National Security Advisor, sir," the agent replied. "There is a situation requiring your presence in Washington." "What is the situation?" "I'm not authorized to discuss that here, sir," the agent said, looking pointedly around the bar full of civilians. Vance realized he had no choice. Something serious must have happened for him to be sought out with such zeal. He turned to the bar patrons. "I'm so sorry," he said sincerely. "Duty calls. But I promise you I'll come back. And not just here, to this bar. I'll come back to my roots, to my promises." People looked at him with a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and perhaps a grain of hope. Vance knew they had heard plenty of empty promises from politicians, and his words could ring just as hollow. He caught Michael's eye, who was standing to the side, watching the whole scene. His eyes were asking, "Is that all?" "Sir, we really need to go," the agent said urgently. "Just a minute," Vance replied and headed toward Michael. They stood face to face, the Vice President of the United States and the homeless veteran, 2 men brought together by fate on the side of the road. "I have to go," Vance said quietly. "I know," Michael replied. "The world can't wait for the Vice President to talk to a homeless person. This is not the end," Vance extended his hand. "I will find you." Michael looked at the outstretched hand. "Why?" he asked. "You got what you wanted. You got into the real America. You felt like a regular guy from Middletown again. Now you're going back to your ivory tower." Those words hit Vance harder than any physical violence. "That's not true," he said, lowering his hand. Vice President," the agent interrupted him. "The plane is waiting." Vance took one last look at Michael, then turned and allowed the agents to lead him out of the bar. An armored SUV with flashing lights waited outside. "Where are we going?" Vance asked as they set off. "Dayton Airport, sir," the agent replied. "Air Force 2 is cleared for takeoff." Vance nodded and turned to the window. The dark streets of Middletown, the city of his childhood, the city he was leaving behind again, floated past. But this time, something was different. There was a fire burning in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. A fire of determination, anger, hope, all at once. Suddenly, he straightened up. "Stop the car," he ordered. "Sir?" The agent turned around, surprised. "I said stop the car," Vance repeated with such force that the agent instinctively obeyed and signaled to the driver. The SUV pulled up on a quiet street. Vance opened the door. "Sir, what are you doing?" the agent asked anxiously. "I have unfinished business," Vance replied. "I'll be back in an hour. Wait for me here." "Mr. Vice President, I cannot allow you." "That's an order," Vance snapped. 1 hour. Without waiting for an argument, he slammed the door and walked quickly back to the bar. He didn't know if Michael would still be there, but he had to try. The bar was half empty. Many of the patrons had left after he left, probably to tell friends and family about their meeting with the Vice President. But Michael was there, sitting at the same table, staring into his beer. Vance came over and sat down opposite him. Michael looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes. "You're back," he stated. "I promised this wasn't the end," Vance replied. Michael looked him over, as if looking for signs of insincerity. "What do you want from me, Vance?" he asked bluntly. "I gave you everything you were looking for. A glimpse of the real America. Showed you how people like me live. What else?" Vance leaned forward. "I want you to come to Washington with me," he said. Washington greeted them with a light rain and gray skies, as if reflecting Vance's inner state. Air Force 2 landed at Andrews Air Force Base at 6 in the morning. Black cars and grim-faced Secret Service agents were already waiting on the runway. Michael stared out the window, his face unreadable, but the tension in his hands gripping the armrests. His life had been turned upside down in the last 12 hours. He had been begging by the side of the road in the evening, and now he was walking down the steps of the Vice President's plane. "Ready?" Vance asked, rising from his chair. Michael nodded silently. There was nothing to say. Everything had already been said that night in the Middletown bar when they had made their agreement, which could have cost Vance his political career and Michael the last vestiges of anonymity. They walked down the ramp into a drizzle, Vance leading the way, his shoulders squared as if preparing for battle. Michael followed, still wearing his tattered military jacket and carrying an army backpack, a sight that made the Secret Service agents exchange puzzled glances. "Mr. Vice President," the senior agent greeted him. "The car is ready. President Trump will be expecting you in the Oval Office in an hour." "Thank you, Johnson," Vance said, pointing to Michael. "This is Michael Raines, my new special advisor. He'll be with me at the meeting." The agent flinched slightly but kept a professional expression on his face. "Yes, sir. We need to get him a pass and go through security." "Get to it immediately," Vance ordered. "In the meantime, we're going to my residence. Mr. Raines needs to get ready for the meeting." On the way to Washington, Michael was silent, looking out the window at the city passing by, which rarely saw homeless people and beggars in its heart. Only tourists, politicians, and lobbyists. Two worlds, two Americas, divided by an invisible wall. "What are you thinking about?" Vance asked, breaking the silence. Michael turned to face him. "That you're probably making the biggest mistake of your life," he answered honestly. "Trump is going to smash you for this." Vance allowed himself a slight smile. "Maybe, but you know what? I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of weighing every word, every action, thinking about the political consequences." He looked out the window at the monuments and buildings, symbols of the power he represented. "My grandmother used to say, if you're not willing to fight for what you believe in, then don't even start." It took me too long to forget those words. They arrived at the vice presidential residence on the grounds of the Naval Observatory, a stately mansion that had served as the home of vice presidents since 1974. The contrast between the opulent building and Michael's shabby figure could not have been more striking. Aides and staff at the residence lined up to greet the vice president, but when they saw his companion, their faces showed poorly concealed surprise. "Mark," Vance said to his senior aide, "this is Michael Raines, my new special advisor on Veterans Affairs. He needs a suit for his meeting with the president, as well as the necessary accommodations for living here." Mark Pearson, a 35-year-old Princeton graduate who had served in 2 presidential campaigns, had always prided himself on his ability to remain unflappable in any situation. But now he was clearly confused. "Sir, He paused, looking from Vance to Michael and back again. "Of course, I'll take care of it immediately, but I need to discuss some urgent matters with you, in private." "Later, Mark," Vance said firmly. "Right now, the priority is preparing for the meeting with the president." He turned to Michael. "Go with Mark. He'll take care of everything. We'll meet here in 40 minutes and go to the White House together." Michael hesitated, clearly feeling out of place in this setting. "Are you sure I'm needed at this meeting?" he asked quietly. "Absolutely," Vance replied. "You're the centerpiece of what I'm about to propose." After Michael left with Mark, Vance headed to his office. He needed to prepare for what might be the most important and dangerous conversation of his political career. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop, intending to write out his talking points, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, his thoughts wandered back to the last 24 hours, to the image of Michael standing by the road with his hand outstretched, to the abandoned steel mill, to the tense faces of the bar patrons. Behind these images was a deeper truth, the truth of a country divided not only politically, but economically, socially, culturally. A country that had lost something important in the pursuit of global leadership. The phone on the table rang, breaking him out of his reverie. "Yes," he answered. "Mr. Vice President," came the secretary's voice. "The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is on the line. He says it's urgent." Vance frowned. Usually the chairman only contacted him in cases of serious crisis. "Connect me." After a brief greeting, General Martins got down to business. "Mr. Vice President, we have confirmed information about an impending terrorist attack on U.S. soil. A group associated with ISIS is planning an attack on an East Coast metropolis. Details are still being finalized, but President Trump has already convened the National Security Council. You are expected in the Situation Room in 30 minutes. "I will be there," Vance answered briefly and hung up. His plans had changed dramatically. They were no longer about political initiatives, but about national security. But that did not mean he would abandon his intentions. Rather, the context made them even more urgent. He picked up the phone and dialed the internal number. "Mark, change your plans. Michael and I are going to the White House immediately. And yes, he's still coming with me." 20 minutes later, a black limousine with the vice president's flags pulled onto the White House grounds. Vance and Michael, dressed in a hastily tailored suit, walked through security, Michael, who had been given a temporary top-level security pass by the Vice President's personal order, drew surprised glances from White House staffers. "Are you sure I should be here?" he asked for the umpteenth time as they walked down the historic corridor toward the West Wing. "More than," Vance replied. "Especially now." They were met at the entrance to the Situation Room by the President's National Security Advisor, John Bolton. "Mr. Vice President," he greeted, then his gaze fell on Michael. "And this is my special advisor, Michael Raines," Vance introduced him. "He has top security clearance." Bolton clearly wanted to object, but there was no time. He nodded and opened the door to the Situation Room. Inside, key figures from the administration had already gathered. President Trump, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the FBI Director, the CIA Director, and other members of the National Security Council. All eyes turned to the Vice President and his unusual companion as they entered. President Trump, with his distinctive hairdo and determined expression, sat up straight in his chair. "J.D., he said, using the informal form of address, "I'm glad you got here so quickly. We've got a serious situation." His gaze fell on Michael and he fell silent. "Who is this?" There was undisguised surprise in his voice. "Michael Raines, my new special advisor," Vance introduced, gesturing for Michael to sit next to him. "A veteran of Afghanistan with 3 tours. I'm sure his experience can be useful in the context of today's discussion." A murmur ran through the room. Michael's appearance, despite his new suit, betrayed a man who had recently been living on the streets. His long hair, beard, and calloused hands contrasted sharply with the well-groomed figures of the politicians and generals. "Okay," Trump said, eyeing Michael closely. "I like veterans, the best people in America. But we'll discuss that later. Right now, we have a more pressing matter." The next hour was spent in intense discussion. Intelligence had received information about a possible terrorist attack on one of the 3 East Coast metropolises, New York, Washington, or Boston. A group of militants trained in ISIS training camps in Syria were believed to be already in the United States. "We have raised the terrorist threat level to red," the FBI director reported. "Security at key facilities has been increased, and checks are being conducted at transportation hubs." "What about a military response?" Trump asked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "We are preparing to strike training camps in Syria," General Martins replied. "We are just waiting for your order, sir." Vance watched the discussion in silence. He noticed that Michael was also listening attentively, frowning at times but not interfering. "What do we know about this group's motives?" Vance finally asked. "Why now? Why these goals?" The CIA director shrugged. "Standard Islamist motives, Mr. Vice President. Hatred of the Western way of life, desire to establish a caliphate, revenge for our operations in the Middle East." "That's too simplistic," Michael suddenly interjected, causing everyone to turn to look at him. "ISIS is not a monolithic organization with a single ideology. Different cells have different motivations." "And how do you know this, Mr.?" asked the Secretary of State with barely concealed disdain. "Raines," Michael replied, unfazed. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with special forces. We worked with the local population, studied the structure of terrorist organizations." He turned to the CIA director. "What do you know about the leader of this particular cell?" The CIA director, clearly surprised by the direct question from the unknown advisor, paused, then replied, "Apronam. Abu Hamza al-Anabi, Algerian, joined ISIS in 2018, trained in Syria, known for his brutality even by ISIS standards." Michael nodded. "An Algerian," he thought. "Have his connections with U.S. veterans organizations been checked?" There was silence in the room. "Why?" the FBI director asked, frowning. "Because in recent years, ISIS has been actively recruiting disillusioned American veterans," Michael explained, "especially those who suffer from PTSD, who don't get proper medical care, who end up on the street. I personally know 3 guys who have received such offers." The information caused a wave of whispers in the room. Trump leaned forward, his gaze becoming more intense. "Are you saying that our veterans can cooperate with terrorists?" he asked bluntly. "Not all of them, of course," Michael replied. "But some, the most desperate, the most abandoned by the system. Yes, they become easy targets for recruitment. They are offered purpose, brotherhood, money, everything they lost when they returned home." Vance watched with pride as Michael, despite his appearance and lack of formal education, demonstrated a deep understanding of the problem of terrorism. "That's very interesting," Trump said, exchanging a glance with the FBI director. "I've always said we have to do a better job of taking care of our veterans. Better than any administration before us. And we are doing that, but obviously not enough." The discussion continued, but now Michael was listened to more attentively. He did not say much, but when he did, his words were precise, based on real experience, not theoretical calculations. After 2 hours of intense debate, Trump summed it up. We're beefing up security at 3 potential targets, preparing for the biggest strikes yet against training camps in Syria. And, he pointed a finger at Michael, checking for possible links to veterans organizations. Great job, everyone. When the meeting ended, Trump asked Vance and Michael to stay behind. The rest of the council members left, leaving the 3 of them alone. So J.D., Trump began when they were alone, where did this guy come from? I know all your advisors, but this is the first time I've seen him. Vance straightened up, ready for this conversation. I met him yesterday, Mr. President, during my trip to Ohio. Without security, Trump noted. Security was in a panic. I was too, by the way. I thought the Democrats had kidnapped you. Despite the joking tone, there was a note of irritation in his voice. I needed time alone with my thoughts, Vance explained, to get back to my roots, to see how ordinary people live. And how do they live? Trump asked, turning his gaze to Michael. Judging by the look of you, Mr. Raines, not very well. Michael did not flinch under the president's intense gaze. I'm not typical, Mr. President, he replied. But yes, many veterans have it tough. The support system is too bureaucratic, too slow to respond to real needs. Trump nodded, tapping his fingers on the table. I promised to take better care of veterans than any president before me, and we've done a lot. The Veterans Choice Act increased funding, but obviously it's not enough. He turned to Vance. You want this man to be your advisor? The man you picked up on the side of the road? Yes, Mr. President, Vance replied firmly. Michael has unique experience and insight into the issues facing veterans. As you saw at the meeting, his knowledge could be invaluable to our administration. Trump looked at both of them for a long moment, then suddenly slammed his hand on the table. I love it, he said. That's exactly what our administration needs. Real people with real experience, not these Ivy League grads who've never seen the real America. Vance and Michael exchanged surprised glances. But, Trump continued, raising a finger, I want a full background check. FBI, military records, medical records. Everything has to be perfect. No skeletons in the closet that could embarrass the administration. Of course, Mr. President, Vance agreed. And, Trump looked directly at Michael, I want you to get a haircut and shave. There are standards in the White House. Michael involuntarily touched his beard. Yes, sir. Okay, Trump stood up, signaling the conversation was over. J.D., I want you to hold a press conference. Today, announce a new initiative to support veterans. Introduce your new advisor. Show America that we care about those who fought for our country. Vance couldn't believe his ears. He expected resistance, long debates, political maneuvering, but Trump, with his usual unpredictability, fully supported his initiative. Thank you, Mr. President, he said. We won't let you down. You better not, Trump replied, his face serious, then suddenly smiled. That would be a great move. The Democrats never expected us to actually care about ordinary Americans. That would knock the wind out of their candidates' sails in the next election. When they left the Situation Room, Michael looked stunned. What was that? He asked when they were out of earshot. He actually agreed? That easy? It's never easy with Trump, Vance said. But yes, he agreed. And that gives us a chance to really make a difference. They headed to the West Wing, where the Vice President's office was located. Along the way, Vance noticed White House staffers casting curious glances at Michael, but now the glances were less dismissive and more curious. Word of his appearance at the National Security Council meeting had probably spread. Mark was waiting for them in the office, agitated and clearly unhappy. Mr. Vice President, he began, the press has already received information that you disappeared yesterday without protection. CNN is preparing a story. We need to prepare a statement urgently. I have a better idea, Vance replied. We'll hold a press conference in 2 hours in the Rose Garden, at the direction of President Trump. I'll be speaking to the press myself. Mark looked stunned. Sir, this is unusual. We don't usually make announcements like this without careful preparation. Times are changing, Mark, Vance said. Get your team together. We need to prepare a statement. The next 2 hours were spent in feverish preparation. Vance and Michael locked themselves in their office, discussing the main points of the program. Michael, despite his lack of political experience, proved surprisingly astute and practical. We need to reduce the waiting time for medical care, he said. Currently, a veteran can wait months to receive the necessary treatment. During this time, many break down, start drinking, take drugs. It's going to require additional funding, Vance said, taking notes. Congress will resist. Then we have to show them that this is not just a humanitarian issue, but a national security issue, Michael replied. As we saw at today's meeting, disgruntled veterans can become targets for terrorist recruitment. This is a direct threat to national security. Vance looked at him with new respect. You learn political games quickly. I'm just telling the truth, Michael shrugged. And if it coincides with political gain, so much the better. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the White House Rose Garden was filled with journalists. Rumors of the vice president's sudden disappearance and emergency press conference spread quickly. All major television networks were broadcasting live. Michael, dressed in a new suit, with his hair cut and his beard neatly trimmed, stood behind the podium, nervously adjusting his tie. Next to him was Mark, who had given him a crash course in dealing with the press an hour earlier. Remember, he told Michael, no harsh statements, no details about your past without my permission. If you don't know what to say you'll come back to the issue later. Michael nodded, but his eyes were doubtful. He was a soldier, used to speaking plainly, not a politician, skilled at avoiding answers. Vance stepped up to the podium, and the hubbub of voices instantly died down. He looked confident, his voice firm as he began to speak. Sucrokeem. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Yesterday, I made a decision to spend a day off the record, off the security, away from Washington. I returned to my hometown in Ohio to see how real America lives, and what I saw made me rethink many of our administration's priorities. He paused, looking around at the journalists. At the direction of President Trump, I am announcing the launch of a new veteran support program, American Renaissance. This program will address the real-life issues our service members face after returning from service: access to health care, psychological support, employment, and housing. Journalists began taking notes. Cameras moved closer to the podium. But most importantly, Vance continued, this program will be guided not by theoretical models, but by the real-world experiences of those who have lived through the system and know its flaws from the inside. That's why I'm pleased to introduce you to my new special advisor on Veterans Affairs, Michael Raines. He motioned for Michael to come to the podium. As Michael stood next to him, a murmur ran through the crowd of reporters. Even in his new suit, Michael did not look like a typical Washington bureaucrat. His eyes showed the weariness of a man who had seen real war, not bureaucratic battles. Mr. Raines is a Purple Heart-winning veteran of the war in Afghanistan, Vance introduced him. He served 3 tours with Special Forces. And most importantly for our mission, he knows what it's like to come home and find that your country isn't ready for you to return. The journalist leaned forward, sensing an unusual story. Tell them, Michael, Vance said quietly. Tell them where I found you yesterday. Michael paused for a moment, then stepped toward the microphone. His voice was hoarse, unused to public speaking, but it carried the strength of a man no longer afraid of the truth. Yesterday morning, I was standing on the side of the road in Ohio begging, he said bluntly. I'm a 3-deployment veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, asking cars for $1 to buy food. A shocked silence fell over the room. Photographers feverishly clicked their camera shutters. Vice President Vance was the only person who stopped and looked me in the eye. Not as a problem, not as a statistic, but as a person. He asked my name. He listened to my story. Michael paused, collecting his thoughts. I told him about my friends who hadn't waited for help and had committed suicide, about the system that made veterans wait months to get the treatment they needed, about how easy it was to lose everything, a job, a family, a home, when the demons of war were haunting you and your country was turning its back. There was no accusation in his voice, just a statement of facts, and that made his words even more powerful. Now the vice president has asked me to be his advisor. Frankly, I thought he was crazy. Nervous laughter ran through the room. But then I realized, who better to talk about the problems of veterans than a person who has been through all this trouble? Who better to point out the holes in the system than someone who fell through them to the very bottom? Michael straightened up, his voice stronger. I attended a National Security Council meeting this morning. And you know what I learned there? That terrorist organizations are actively recruiting disillusioned American veterans. People who were willing to die for their country and now feel betrayed by it. A whisper went through the room. This information was not intended for public disclosure. Vance tensed but didn't interrupt Michael. He'd promised not to interfere. Promised to let him tell the truth, no matter how inconvenient it might be. This isn't just a question of justice or gratitude, Michael continued. This is a question of national security. Every veteran we lose to suicide, drugs, or homelessness is not only a human tragedy, it's a potential threat. He turned to Vance. Vice President Vance gave me a second chance. And through this program, we want to give a second chance to thousands of other veterans across the country. Vance stepped up to the microphone again. The American Renaissance program will begin work immediately. We will create a network of rapid response centers across the country where veterans can receive medical, psychological, and social assistance without long waits and bureaucratic red tape. We will launch employment and housing programs. And most importantly, we will listen to the voices of veterans like Michael themselves to understand what is really needed for their reintegration into society. Mr. Vice President, a journalist from the front row shouted, was this initiative agreed upon with President Trump? Yes, Vance answered firmly. The president fully supports this program and its objectives. What about funding? Asked another reporter. Congress has already approved this year's budget. We will reallocate funds within the existing budget, Vance replied. If additional funding is needed, we will ask Congress to do so. I believe that caring for our veterans is an issue that can unite both parties. Mr. Raines, the journalist with the bright red hair, shouted. Naturally, you mentioned that you were begging. Can you tell me how you ended up in this situation? Michael looked at Vance, who nodded. After my third deployment to Afghanistan, I was diagnosed with PTSD, Michael began. I waited 6 months to see a specialist. By then I was self-medicating, with alcohol, then with opioids prescribed by a doctor. I lost my job, my wife left, taking our daughter. The bank repossessed our house, a classic story for many veterans. His directness silenced the journalist. But I don't want you to write about me, he continued. Write about the thousands of other Michael Raines all over the country. The guys who are still sleeping under bridges, while people in Washington talk about how much they're appreciated. At that moment, the doors of the Rose Garden opened and President Trump emerged, flanked by aides and Secret Service agents. Reporters jumped to their feet, cameras turned in his direction. Vance looked surprised. The president's presence had not been planned. Michael tensed, not knowing what to expect. Trump walked up to the podium, gesturing for Vance and Michael to stay put. I heard something important was going on here and decided to join in, he said with his signature smile. Vice President Vance is doing a great job, a very great job. Our veterans deserve the best, and we will give them the best. He put his hand on Michael's shoulder. This man is a real hero, and what he said is a disgrace to our country. We will fix this, I promise you. No one will take better care of veterans than our administration. Trump turned to the cameras. The American Renaissance Program will be the largest veteran support initiative in the history of our country. And Michael Raines, who was homeless yesterday, is standing here in the White House today, helping us do it. That's what real American history is. The president spoke for a few more minutes, praising the initiative and reiterating his commitment to veterans. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, leaving behind stunned reporters and an even more stunned Michael. When the press conference ended and they returned to the vice president's office, Michael collapsed into a chair. What was that? He asked, loosening his tie. Trump. Is he really supporting us, or was that just an act? Vance sat down opposite him. With Trump, you never know. But it doesn't matter now. He has publicly supported the program, and now we can act. Michael shook his head, still not believing what was happening. 24 hours ago, I was standing on the side of the road, hoping to scrape together enough money for a place to sleep and food. Now I'm sitting in the White House after a press conference with the President of the United States. This is crazy. It's not madness, Vance countered. It's an opportunity to make a difference, and we're not going to miss it. At that moment, Mark ran into the office waving a tablet. Sir, you won't believe it. The phones are ringing off the hook. Every channel is broadcasting your press conference. The hashtag Your American Renaissance is already trending on social media. And most importantly, veterans organizations across the country are expressing their support for the initiative. They want to participate. They want to help. Vance smiled, but his eyes remained serious. This is just the beginning, Mark. Now we have a lot of work to do. Start assembling a team, the best specialists in medicine, psychology, social work, and don't forget to include the veterans themselves, not just as consultants, but as key participants in the process. We're working on it, sir, Mark replied, looking at Michael with new respect. And, Mr. Raines, what you said at the press conference, that was very powerful, very honest. After Mark left, Vance and Michael were alone. It was getting dark outside, and the day that had begun at Andrews Air Force Base was drawing to a close. What now, Michael asked, looking out the window at the majestic view of Washington. How long will Trump's enthusiasm last? How long will journalists be interested in a homeless veteran who has become an advisor to the vice president? Vance came over and stood next to him at the window. I don't know, he answered honestly. Politics is unpredictable, especially with a president like Trump. Tomorrow a new scandal, a new crisis could break out, and everyone would forget about our initiative. Or, on the contrary, the program could become the administration's flagship project. He put his hand on Michael's shoulder. But it doesn't matter. Even if we help just one veteran not end up on the side of the road where I met you yesterday, that will already be a victory. Michael nodded, then pulled a tattered photograph from his jacket pocket. My daughter, he said, showing the picture to Wenz. Samantha. She's 8. I haven't seen her in over a year. Beautiful, Vance smiled. Like you. Do you think, Michael's voice wavered, now that I'm not homeless, not a drug addict, her mother will let me see her? Vance looked at the photo, then at Michael. I'll do everything in my power to make it happen, he said firmly. That's a promise. The phone on the table rang again. Vance answered, listened to the caller, and hung up. We just got word, he said. The FBI has 3 suspects in custody in Boston. They're believed to be connected to that ISIS cell that was discussed at the meeting. And you know what? One of them is a former Marine, an Iraq vet. Michael closed his eyes, accepting this difficult news. Then I was right, he said quietly. Yes. Vance walked to the table and began to gather papers. And that makes our mission even more important. We'll be back in the Situation Room in an hour. We've got a long night ahead of us. We? Michael asked. Are you sure I'm supposed to be there? Absolutely, Vance said firmly. This is no longer a political move, Michael. This is what we have to do. For the country, for the veterans, for ourselves. They walked out of the office and down the White House corridor. Secret Service agents followed at a respectful distance. Staffers nodded respectfully, and some came up to introduce themselves and express support. It's a strange feeling, Michael noted. Yesterday, no one even looked at me, and today, everyone wants to shake my hand. Get used to it, Vance chuckled. It's always like this in Washington. Power and influence change people's attitudes instantly. As they walked outside toward the West Wing, the evening sky over Washington was a rich crimson and gold. The Capitol dome glowed like a beacon, guiding the nation through the turbulent seas of modern politics. Michael paused for a moment, looking at the view. You know, he said quietly, when I came back from Afghanistan, I stopped believing in this country. I stopped believing in the big words about freedom, democracy, the American dream. I saw in them only empty propaganda. He turned to Vance. But today I'm almost ready to believe again, to believe that we can be better, that we can fix what's broken. Vance nodded, feeling a long-forgotten fire ignite in his chest, the fire he had felt when he first started out in politics, when he believed he could change the world for the better. We can, he said firmly, and we will, step by step, day by day, starting from today. They continued on to the Situation Room, 2 men who had been brought together by fate on the side of a road in Ohio. The Vice President of the United States and the homeless veteran who had become his advisor. 2 Americans who had decided to fight for the country they still believed in, no matter what. And somewhere at that same gas station in Ohio where this story began, another veteran stood with a cardboard sign, begging for alms from passing cars. Not yet knowing that starting tomorrow, his life, like the lives of thousands like him, could begin to change. Thanks to $1 that Vice President Vance did not give to homeless Michael, offering instead much more, a chance to change the system from within.